Nothing in this podcast is intended as investment advice, and the people in this podcast may hold positions in the stocks they talk about. Do not buy any investment based solely on a tip or recommendation. Please do your own research.
We would like to welcome Anthony to the Midweek Takeaway from Solvonis. They've had some news today on the PTSD, not treatments, but they've picked 3 from 6 now, which seems very interesting. So over to you, Anthony. Give us an overview of what's been happening.
Yeah, Kevin, good to talk to you. And hey, Charles, good to see you again. Good to talk to your audience. So just to remind everyone what we do, we're a biotech. We're developing medicines to treat large disease classes that are currently underserved and under-innovated in big pharma. That is addiction and mental health. We're focused particularly on alcohol use disorder within addiction and PTSD within mental health. Within our PTSD program, we have a preclinical program that we call SVN-SDN14. In that program, we're seeking and we're in the process of developing a new class of medicines to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, what's really important for your audience to know is PTSD affects 13 million people in America and affects 20 million people across US, UK, and big EU economies. There's currently no medicines specifically licensed to treat that disease, and that means there's a large addressable market, a significant unmet medical need, and therefore a material commercial opportunity for companies like Solvonis to innovate in that space. And that's what we're doing with our SVN-SDN14 program, in which we're developing a series of compounds to potentially better treat that disease. And we initially started with a library of a couple of hundred that we ran through some computer models. We identified 6 that warranted further investigation. We had those manufactured. We tested those in vitro, which is in Petri dishes. 3 of those 6 have now produced very positive, robust results. And those results are modulating the serotonin, dopamine, noradrenaline receptors at the brain level. And that is exactly what we wanted them to do. We're now bringing 3 of those forward to be tested in vivo or in animal, which is the next step. And what's really important for us is if you can modulate the serotonin, dopamine, and noradrenaline receptors, you can elicit something called prosocial responses. And that's exactly the kind of response that enables people who suffer with PTSD to engage more effectively and efficiently with therapy and to recover more effectively and more efficiently. And so we're really, really pleased with the results. Those 3 candidates that produced robust results provides us with a deeper number of opportunities, a more potentially robust data set, and let's just be honest, better optionality to identify and land on something that can be successful, both effective, efficacious, and commercially successful.
I would like you to say the word therapy 3 times just for entertainment purposes because of your Irish accent. Joking aside, it's interesting that because the PTSD has got to be a big issue in the US forces now because of all the wars that have been involved in. There must be a huge military proportion of people in the US that are involved in that. Obviously, not just that.
There is. You're exactly right, but unfortunately, the biggest single the contributing factor to developing PTSD is encountering trauma, obviously, and that can be seeing a dead body, being involved in a battlefield, or for frontline workers being involved in traumatic events. But actually, the biggest single contributing factor to developing PTSD is unfortunately sexual assault during your adolescent, preteen, and adolescent years, and that is the significant biggest cause to PTSD. So whilst people think that in America the reason why there are so many more people affected with PTSD is because of the wars, relatively speaking, of the 13 million people that are affected by PTSD in the US, it's not the majority. The majority is people who've experienced trauma, significant trauma during their formative years, and in many cases that is sexual assault. And what happens with the current treatments for PTSD is it's talk-based therapy. It's SSRIs, so selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, to dampen down the response, but then it's talk-based therapy. And as you talk with your therapist, what you need to do is you need to talk through those traumatic events, and the body actually reacts in the same way or a similar way when reliving those traumatic events as to when those traumatic events were first inflicted upon the individual or when you first experienced them. And so what happens is the body's fight or flight response kicks in as you relive those horrific experiences from your formative years. The body's natural response is you clam up and you exit the therapy process. And so it's a really, really drawn out and re-traumatizing experience for the individuals. And it is why there's so few people recover fully from PTSD. And so what we're looking to do is to develop a range of medicines or a class of medicines that dampen down that fight or flight response, boost the empathy response so that you can engage more effectively with therapy and enable people, as I said before, to more efficiently and effectively recover from post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah. No, a lot of that rings true because effectively an awful lot of therapy is just people reliving the whole situation.
Yeah.
I was involved with human givens therapy in the UK, which and Ireland actually, because I did quite a lot of the courses in Dublin. And a lot of that was to do with effectively hypnotherapy, that you relive those processes in second and third person, so that the receptors are no longer as enlightened, if you like. So, they're not giving you the same mental stimulation. So therefore you've calmed the thing down, which is maybe the same as the drugs in terms of the exercise or whatever they are called in terms of the depression. But how do you see this progressing? Because, basically you had 6, and for me anyway, I thought the point was that you're going to choose 1, and now you've chosen 3. So how does that work out?
That's a great question. What I was hoping we were going to get a very clear leader of the 6 when Professor David Nutt, our Chief Scientific Officer, analysed the data. But it turned out we had 3 clear leaders, which is a good problem to have. It's, as I think we've discussed internally, it's an embarrassment of riches. So we have 3 candidates now that modulate serotonin, dopamine, and noradrenaline receptors in exactly the way that we want them to be modulated. And so we're bringing those forward into the next stage, which is in vivo studies or in vivo studies. And we'll begin those over the next couple of months, and we'll keep investors and the markets updated as we progress. But we would hope then and plan certainly to have a lead identified at the end of that process that we could then bring forward into what are called IND enabling studies. And those are the studies that are required to pull together the data package to enable you to apply to bring your medicine or your drug into humans for the first time.
What specific data point, though, are you looking at?
So you don't
pick that
sorry,
candidate. Sorry, Cav. You might be asking the same question.
The data points we're looking at are how the drugs modulate the serotonin, dopamine, and noradrenaline pathways and receptors. Beyond that, I'm just not in a position to talk about specifically what we are doing and how we are modulating those receptors for now.
So I guess the question is, would you combine this potentially with SSRIs? Because SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, they prevent the reabsorption of serotonin. Basically, the idea is there's more serotonin that can go through neurotransmitters. So you increase your serotonin levels, and that helps you regulate your mood, reduce your anxiety, and help with PTSD. But they've not really worked particularly well so far. And so we know that for the alcohol use case, 001, the initial indications are much better. But I guess the idea is how much better than SSRIs are these treatments hoped to be? Obviously, we're very early stage.
We're at a very early stage, and it would be too early for me to define how well these would perform in humans against current standard of care and against placebo.
Okay, fair enough. Sorry, I'm just trying. It's tricky, isn't it? Because it is very early stage, but also very promising. And I think also,
it's very early stage, but certainly promising. But what these drugs do at that receptor level, we're just not really ready to talk about right now. But our Chief Scientific Officer, Professor David Nutt, is very experienced in this space, and he's pleased with what we've seen so far.
I guess the thing is with PTSD, a lot of people have tried various therapies, various medications, it hasn't worked, and kind of like the alcohol use case, just thrown in the towel and, given up on it. In terms of, talking about patent status, the protection horizon for the three shortlisted candidates, they're very early stage. So I guess, how is the IP protected? Is it protected yet? Are we not there yet?
Well, the IP is protected through two patents that have been filed. Those patents have not been granted as of yet. But we believe these are completely novel compounds on completely novel scaffolds. And we are working through the patent process in the US, the UK, and the EU. It takes a number of years from initial filing, so where the protection starts, to being granted. So we are in that process for these molecules or these compounds. And I should say, you may not always want the patents granted as quickly as possible because the clock starts ticking at that stage. But we have a very robust IP protection strategy in place for these three compounds.
And then final question from me in terms of development timeline. Again, it's early days, but just broadly, where would you look at the development timeline? How long might it take before you're, into, serious clinical trials, say phase 1? And then in terms of putting a valuation on these at the moment, they're probably assigned very little, if no value. Might you be able to put a valuation on them in a year or two, or is that too early?
From my perspective, so the next step is the in vivo studies. And from there, we would select a lead. We then got to run a series of studies, IND-enabling studies, before we would really be in a position to determine sort of development timelines. So you're looking at a couple of years before, 1 to 2 years before these would be in human. And I think you really want to be at the end of phase 1. So your first human studies before you could put a real valuation on them. But I think what this does and how this speaks then to the overall process and plan and strategy that we have in the organization is we have a dual R&D strategy, the process that we're following, where we're focusing on repurposing drugs and also then developing our own compounds. So we've got our two programs that are in the clinic now. So they're in human now, focused on alcohol use disorder. 001, that as you mentioned before, is in phase 3, and that we're in discussions with a number of pharma companies to out-license that program. Phase 3 started in July of last year and is forecast to complete late 26, early 27, and then data analysis, data readout through the course of 27, marketing authorization application in 28, and ideally all things working well, being in market in the UK in 2029, generating revenue, but potentially being out-licensed to a pharma partner before that. We've got the 002 program that's focused on the much, much larger market in the US and is in phase 2B preparation. We're planning. We're currently working to establish the scientific bridge into the reference product, J&J's Spravato, that is a blockbuster drug and is forecast to generate $1.4 billion in revenue this year. Peak revenue forecast $3 to $5 billion within the next 3 to 5 years. That is on label in the US for treatment-resistant depression with suicidal ideation, which affects about 2 million people in the US. There's 20 million people in the US suffering with moderate to severe alcohol use disorder, which is where this program is focused. There's 15,500 clinics in the US already treating people with alcohol use disorder. So the sales potential, revenue and commercial potential for that program is quite material. And so we have those programs that are focused near-term revenue generating or commercial opportunities in clinic, in human, with valuations associated with them. And then we have there are preclinical programs focused on PTSD, where we now have positive in vitro results, moving now into in vivo studies before moving into IND enabling studies. And we have our AI drug discovery programs, much earlier stage and focused again on large disease classes. So what we have is we have a very, very balanced portfolio that provides us with near-term commercial opportunities, medium-term commercial opportunities, and significant pipeline depth for longer-term commercial opportunities, all of which are focused at large disease classes with relatively poor current standards of care, and therefore significant commercial opportunities for companies like us to innovate. And the comparator that I always bring people back to is the GLP-1s. GLP-1s, like Ozempic, forecast to be the largest single selling drug class in the history of the pharma industry. They're not very innovative. They were well known, well understood, initially pointed at diabetes. Pfizer said no. Novo took it up, pointed it at obesity, turned Novo from a middle, and also ran to Europe's largest company by market cap. Yes, they've trailed off a little bit, but looks like they're now coming back because Eli had poor data in one of their programs.
Yeah.
And that's because they innovated. They took something that was well understood and well known, pointed it at a different disease class that affects many, many millions of people, and it turned on a dime. And that's what we do as a company, is we seek to treat large disease classes and innovate in those spaces. And in my opinion, I think that creates an interesting opportunity for shareholders and investors.
So, Anthony, last question. With this patent protection cliff that all of these farmers are facing, how quickly is someone going to get the checkbook out and sort you out?
I don't know, but if the people want to just look up a company called Gilgamesh, reported on Bloomberg and Reuters last week or 2 weeks ago that AbbVie are in discussions to acquire them for $1 billion. They have assets that are similar to ours, but not as mature a stage as ours. You look at Atai, MindMed, Compass, all, US listed. Compass is a UK company, but listed on one of the New York exchanges. They're all valued at 10, 20x where we are, and our IP, and I shouldn't say our IP, but our programs are the same level of development. So we are in discussions with a couple of pharma companies to out-license our 001 program, not at the same size as AbbVie, but we think that the pharma industry is now paying attention to the sector in which we operate. There have been a number of blockbuster deals done over the last 18 months in the mental health space, and there's a large pharma company circling a direct peer of ours. So we think this is an interesting time, certainly for our sector, and potentially, hopefully, also for us.
I'll chime in there with the AbbVie and Gilgamesh. It was back into, I think it was May 2024, they first announced that collaboration and option to, license agreement. And it was generally, I think it's for psychiatric disorders, wasn't it? From the top of my head, a while ago. I haven't seen the recent news.
It's depression, and their portfolio is depression and addiction.
Depression and addiction, right? So I think one of the key takeaways here is, you're talking to pharma companies, and I won't ask you to name them because I know you'll just say that you can't.
I can't name them anyway.
but I think one of the key things is that there's a very kind of a set timeline, especially with the patent cliff falling off, such that if you announce a collaboration or an option to license agreement or a combination thereof, and then a year, 2 years down the line, as long as both parties are happy, that's your natural takeover partner. Should all go well. Can't speak to that. We have a very clear program or a very clear strategy where we develop assets, we progress them as efficiently as we possibly can through the R&D stage gates, and then we seek to out-license them. And probably just what I'd end on is the phase 3 program for the 001 asset that we're executing in collaboration with the Department of Health in the UK through the NIHR, the MRC, NHS, and also with the University of Exeter. The total price for that trial is 2.25 million sterling. For a 280 person phase 3 trial, potentially definitive, is unheard of. And our costs to that trial are currently capped at 800,000 sterling. So we really, really do live by what we say, which is an extreme focus on being efficient with CapEx in order to progress R&D forward, to then get it to a point where it's interesting to larger companies.
I think we'll end there because you can't tell us anymore, but we have to see that there is great potential ahead, I think. And good luck with your negotiations.
Thank you kindly. Speak to you soon, guys. Cheers.
Yeah, all the best.
Bye-bye.
This podcast was brought to you by Roast PR Limited. If you would like to appear on a future episode of The Sunday Roast, please email admin@thesundayroast.net.